You're just in the way. Don't you get it yet? An unqualified middle school graduate like you should just stand outside and wait. My manager, James, who had tagged along uninvited to a business negotiation worth $20 million, shouted at me with a clear look of anger. He then turned his back on me and quickly tried to start the negotiation with Mr. Ingram, the client's president. But Mr. Ingram, flustered, managed to muster a voice. "What are you saying? Do you even know who Michael is?" "Of course, I know. Michael is my subordinate, a middle school graduate with no significant skills, an utterly incompetent man." James was laughing smugly, but in the next instant, his face turned pale. "My name is Michael. I'm a 42-year-old company employee. I work for a foreign company that operates an e-commerce website. Our company is a bit different. It was founded by a young man who was a recluse in the United States. He was a born genius, and because his IQ was so high, he found going to school pointless and stopped going to school. Although he was encouraged to utilize the accelerated program, he found the framework of school too tedious, so he learned the basics by himself, which is quite impressive. As he continued to learn various things, his interest shifted to programming, and he developed software for programming on his own. Eventually, he launched an e-commerce website selling goods online and kept expanding his influence. That momentum didn't stop, and now the company has grown to have branches worldwide, not just in the United States. Because the founder is a free spirit, the workplace where I work also has a very open atmosphere. The company, which began with people who understood the founder's background and agreed with him, still maintains the same direction today. One day, I was interviewed by a certain media outlet. The interview request came from an economic web magazine looking to feature me as someone working for a company currently gaining momentum in Japan. "So, Michael, is it true that your highest level of education is middle school?" "Yes, that's correct." I nodded honestly, and the reporter's eyes widened in surprise. "In Japan, there is still a strong tendency to value academic background. So I'm used to this kind of reaction regarding my middle school education, but it seems my way of life is quite different from others. I understand this might be rude, but your background is quite unusual." "I'm sorry. But is it common for someone like you to work in a company running an e-commerce website?" "No, it's rather unique to our company. As you can see from our founder's background, we have an environment that welcomes employees like me who don't fit the typical mold. I started working at this company 5 years ago. My previous work experience and the nature of my work caught their attention, and they invited me to join the company. Personally, I like this company's free spirit, which values individuality and emphasizes skill over tenure or academic background, no matter how large it grows. Thanks to this company culture, I've been able to work freely and comfortably since I joined. Since the company values employee autonomy, there is no concern about power dynamics or hierarchies, and no one, including me, cares about such things. Especially among the foreign employees, there are people with similar backgrounds to the founder. So no one cares about anyone's final academic record. So, I'm quite satisfied with the current environment and work hard every day. Therefore, I never expected the situation to change suddenly. The turning point for the company came when a new manager transferred from another department. This manager, named James, is 4 years younger than me. He's still only 38 years old. James was hired as a talented individual who graduated from a prestigious university and was quickly promoted to manager. He attended a prestigious private school with an internal progression system, advancing from kindergarten through university. Naturally, he was born into a wealthy family that could easily pay for all that education. And it seems his current position is also the result of connections, according to rumors. It's said that James's father and our CEO, Mr. Smith, have been friends for a long time. And that's why he got the job without the usual hiring process. However, none of the employees saw this connection-based hire as a big problem. That's because Mr. Smith is a caring person who values his employees and understands our company's culture well. We trusted that Mr. Smith would not allow a mere nepotistic hire. We thought James might just be someone with a good starting point, given his connection to Mr. Smith, but he could still be a promising individual. However, our expectations were quickly shattered. James, who appeared before us, had quite a troublesome personality. From the day he gave his introductory speech, he began boasting about his academic background to all the employees. As for his actual job performance, it was poor. He begrudgingly worked on even the simplest tasks like creating basic documents, often with a scowl on his face. On a daily basis, James looks down on colleagues who graduated from lesser-known universities, calling them ordinary citizens, and refers to those with only a middle or high school education as outliers. You should all understand that not everyone is equal from the moment they are born. When someone of a higher rank like me is standing in front of you, you lowly outliers probably get so nervous you can't even speak. He says such things with a straight face, so it was only natural that he was quickly shunned after his transfer. James is quite confident, but he seems to have a particular dislike for me, and among our sales team. His snide comments toward me are disproportionately frequent. I heard you're a middle school graduate. You're beyond just an outlier, you don't even seem like the same human being. I've never had a subordinate with just a middle school education, so I don't even know what to talk to you about. He says this loudly, giving me a mocking look. Hearing these insulting, provocative words repeatedly, many in the department began to question James's character and professional ability. Apparently, James had the same attitude at his previous company, where he had also been hired through his family's connections. However, due to his troublesome personality, he was given only simple clerical tasks and was left on the sidelines. But James, convinced of his own superiority, was quite frustrated with being assigned only simple tasks. This workplace doesn't understand my value. They don't appreciate me. That's why they're giving me such trivial work, he declared, leaving his previous company in a huff and joining ours. However, even at our company, he wasn't allowed to participate in any major deals. As a result, he became thoroughly disgruntled and began openly slacking off. Just as he had done at his previous job, he hardly did any real work, instead catching passing colleagues to boast about himself and lecture them. I graduated from a prestigious university, you know. I even get along well with the top executives at that company. When a deal was about to fall through, it was all thanks to me that it was salvaged. James would stop any passing colleagues and boast loudly, refusing to do any actual work. Worse yet, he neither had any knowledge of the work nor made any effort to learn. He even avoided attending regular meetings. Some colleagues began to wonder how someone like James could remain in the company for so long. Perhaps James was able to remain a manager because the company had grown so large. The company used to attract a sharp, unique crowd, often scouts from other firms or individuals with unconventional backgrounds. But now, it has become an environment where people with standard academic backgrounds who went through the usual job application process work alongside each other. This has made it seem more like an ordinary company, one that has even started accepting nepotism hires. In this context, the company has continued to employ highly educated but non-performing employees like James. However, James himself shows no doubt about his capabilities and proudly states, "I'm delegating the actual work to the regular employees." As a capable manager, I'm great at supervising and directing my subordinates. After a while, everyone gave up on treating James seriously and started to ignore him as long as he wasn't actively causing trouble. It was actually better for us if he just slacked off, as he wasn't much help even when he tried to work. This approach to handling James became well known within the department, but soon it led to a problematic situation. James had always been quick to attack me due to my educational background, but when he realized no one was paying attention to him, he focused on targeting me even more. An interview with a web magazine? Don't get carried away just because someone gave you a little attention. I'm not getting carried away, I replied calmly. As soon as the interview I had given was published, James scowled and came up to me. Seeing others receive praise while he was ignored seemed to irritate him, and he couldn't resist complaining. I heard you also managed to secure a few contracts with major manufacturers. Yes, I was just following up on existing contracts, I replied. Upon hearing my response, James snatched the contract documents from my desk and stared at them intently. As he flicked the documents dismissively with one hand, he sneered. "Well, I guess a middle school graduate like you could only come up with a plan of this caliber. If I were in charge, there wouldn't be such a shoddy proposal. After all, there's a limit to what someone with your level of education can do." His blatant words left me stunned, and I could only remain silent. James probably thought of himself as a younger, more educated man, the complete opposite of me, a middle school graduate, and enjoyed feeling superior. For James, there seemed to be no easier target to feel superior to than me. Still, his words left me utterly exasperated. If I were handling this contract, I could have leveraged my connections from a top-tier private school. I would have turned it into something far more impressive than anything a middle school graduate like you could manage. That may be true. James's boasts always sounded like a child showing off. He seemed to believe that, as a highly educated person, he had hidden talents and abilities yet to be revealed and that he was an exceptionally capable person. I had met people like him before, but never anyone who so openly insulted others. I thought I could endure it until he was transferred again. But constantly having my achievements belittled and mocked gradually wore me down mentally. However, James still held a position of authority over us, making it difficult to directly oppose him. As the atmosphere in the department grew increasingly tense, I decided to take the lead and directly approach Mr. Smith, our CEO. On behalf of the team, I suggested that James be either given guidance or reassigned, but I never anticipated that this would backfire. One day, I was steadily preparing for an upcoming negotiation. Then, suddenly, James walked briskly over to me and started saying something completely unexpected. "Hey, Michael, I know you've been working hard, but I've decided that this negotiation is too much responsibility for you. So, I need you to step down." "What? That's not true. I've been in charge from the beginning, and they've been happy with my handling of it," I replied, completely taken aback by his sudden announcement. The client I was preparing to negotiate with had been a partner since I joined the company. We had a long-standing relationship, and our previous meetings had gone smoothly. But despite my explanation, James just shook his head as if he were dealing with a fool. "You just don't get it, do you? Did you check the client's background? He's an elite, just like me, with a high-level education. Yes, Mr. Ingram graduated from one of the most prestigious universities. He is an accomplished individual who runs an IT company. But how does that justify changing the person in charge? Being told out of the blue to step down from a client I had built a strong relationship with and gained trust from over the years was something I simply could not accept. I protested, but James ignored me and snatched up the documents I had prepared. He barely skimmed through them before confidently stating, "There's no way I can let a middle school graduate like you handle such an elite client. Only someone with a high-level education, like me, can handle this. But Mr. Ingram specifically requested that I handle this account. Mr. Smith, our CEO, is also aware of this." I insisted, determined to stand my ground in dropping Mr. Smith's name. I figured that the best way to deal with James, who had gotten his position through connections, was to have Mr. Smith call him out. Surprisingly, James burst out laughing as soon as I mentioned Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith himself asked me to do this. "I feel sorry for you, Michael. From now on, I'm supposed to mentor you closely, as per Mr. Smith's direct orders." He said this with an exasperated look and then reached out his hand. "Now that you understand the situation, hand over the rest of the materials. It's just not common sense to have a middle school graduate like you deal with an elite client. With all due respect, Mr. Ingram has expressed his desire to continue working with me. Changing the person in charge without any notice could cause problems." As I refused to back down, James's expression grew increasingly irritated. "That's just flattery on their part. The fact that you don't understand something so simple proves how dim-witted you are because you're lowly educated. There's no flattery at play. The client knows me very well. He must have realized that I wasn't going to change my stance." James clicked his tongue in frustration, and before I could say anything else, he bluntly declared, "Anyway, I'll be handling the negotiation. If you make any moves without authorization, I'll make sure you're dealt with." In hindsight, I probably should have consulted Mr. Smith then and there. But I believed that if I handled things properly, I could overcome this challenge, so I prepared for the day of the negotiation. Leading up to this day, I had been pushed around by James quite a bit. After all, this was a major negotiation worth $20 million. James seemed desperate for the credit and tried various tactics to keep me out of the meeting and take it on himself. I somehow managed to attend alongside him, but he seemed quite excited, standing before such a big deal. At the client's office, Mr. Ingram, the contact person, was already waiting for us and welcomed us in with a smile. Mr. Ingram had graduated from a prestigious university in Japan, then studied at an elite university in the United States. After graduation, he was involved in management at an American company before returning to Japan to expand his current business, which was also in partnership with our company. "I'm sorry for calling you here today." "No, thank you for having us." Mr. Ingram had a friendly and cheerful personality, and even in important negotiations, he took the initiative to create a relaxed atmosphere. Thanks to his considerate demeanor, we were able to communicate comfortably and openly. But just then, James stepped in front of me and said, "Mr. Ingram, if I may, I'll be taking over as the person in charge of this negotiation starting today. My name is James, and I am the head of the sales planning department. I apologize if you've been inconvenienced by having someone like Michael in charge up until now." Without even glancing at the bewildered Mr. Ingram, James immediately spread out his materials and tried to start the negotiation. Mr. Ingram, surprised, glanced over at me, but I couldn't very well call out James in front of him. For now, I decided to let the negotiation proceed and took a seat next to James. But James, his temper flaring, turned to me and shouted aggressively, "Who said you could sit down? You're in the way. Can't you understand that yet? A useless middle school graduate should wait outside." He waved his hand dismissively, like shooing away a stray dog. His rudeness was so extreme that I was stunned beyond anger. Don't you get it yet? This is why people like you, with such a disappointing level of education, can't even comprehend how offensive it is to be in the same room. James wore a smug grin, emphasizing again that I was a middle school graduate. Feeling quite confident, he turned his back to me and quickly tried to begin the negotiation with Mr. Ingram. Mr. Ingram remained completely still for a moment, but then finally managed to force out a response. "What on earth are you saying? Do you even know who Michael is?" James, startled by the anxiety and irritation in Mr. Ingram's voice, widened his eyes in surprise. "Of course, I know. Michael is my subordinate, a middle school graduate with no significant skills, an utterly incompetent man." James's smug laughter left Mr. Ingram looking at me with an expression that suggested he was at a complete loss for words. It was clear that James really knew nothing about me. As I shook my head to convey this thought, Mr. Ingram put his hand to his forehead, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Observing the exchange between Mr. Ingram and me, James opened his mouth with a displeased expression. "What's the matter with Michael? If he has caused any trouble so far, I apologize. After all, he is just a middle school graduate. It's really unfortunate that someone like him managed to sneak into our company." "No, actually, he is." Unable to hold back any longer, Mr. Ingram tried to cut off James's rambling. But James, now thoroughly excited, began to ingratiate himself with Mr. Ingram instead. "In contrast, I graduated from a prestigious university. While I can't quite match your impressive credentials, Mr. Ingram, you can rest assured that from now on, I will be handling everything personally." With each word James spoke, it felt as though the temperature in the room was gradually dropping. Yet, unaware of this, he continued with his fake smile, pushing aggressively to take control of this $20 million negotiation. "I'm sure that incompetent middle school graduate couldn't explain things properly, so allow me to go over everything with you." "Very well." Mr. Ingram replied with a heavy nod, which made James grin triumphantly, thinking he had won. But then, it was Mr. Ingram who changed the course of the conversation. "Did you say your name was James? It's become quite clear to me that you have no idea who Michael is." "What? What do you mean?" In a clear and steady voice, Mr. Ingram calmly began to explain to James. "James, you don't seem to know that Michael here is a co-founder of your company's parent company, the American headquarters." "Huh? Co-founder? Michael? No way." James muttered, clearly stunned by the unexpected revelation. He seemed so shocked that he forgot to use formal language in front of Mr. Ingram. Letting out a long sigh, Mr. Ingram began to speak more slowly, with a hint of exasperation. "If you kept up with economic news, you would know this already." "Michael's name is everywhere," Mr. Ingram remarked. With that, he operated his tablet and held it out, displaying an interview article about me on the screen. The screen displayed not only the recent web media interview but also various past articles, books, industry news, and appearances on radio and TV, all featuring my face and name. The truth was, my life had been quite similar to that of the company's founder. In Japanese schools, the rigid curriculum felt dull to me. Since Japan had no accelerated programs, I found attending school to be a waste of time and instead stayed home to learn programming on my own. During that time, I came across the business of the founder, who had already established the company and, out of curiosity, began examining it until I found a bug. Pointing it out via email led to a personal correspondence. Over time, as our cross-continental correspondence continued, the founder grew fond of me and directly invited me to the US. When he was building the current company, he made me a co-founder to help with dividing work and improving efficiency. The company then grew steadily, and, feeling I had done enough, I decided to retire. Just as I was considering taking it easy in Japan, Mr. Smith, who I already knew, reached out, and I decided to join this company. At that time, the Japanese branch managed by Mr. Smith was still small. But I was moved by his passion and determination to establish a convenient e-commerce site in Japan. Having long forgotten the passion for work that I once had when the company grew big in the US, I was reminded of it again. So I started working here 5 years ago, on the condition that I could work on the front lines. James, who had been staring at the tablet for some time, gradually lost his smile, his face turning pale. Watching him, Mr. Ingram quietly began to speak. I know what Michael has accomplished, which is precisely why I wanted to work with him. Please understand that. But he is really just a middle school graduate. It's an embarrassing background to have anywhere. James shouted hysterically, spitting his words out in confusion. His long-held belief in academic elitism had shattered. And learning the truth about the person he had looked down on so much caused him to lose his composure completely. With a forced smile, James kept trying to ingratiate himself with Mr. Ingram, almost desperately. Michael is a man without knowledge or education, a disgrace. Allow me to take over from this fool. And I implore you to go ahead with the contract. What I value is not academic background, but actual achievements. Moreover, I have no desire to speak with someone like you. At this pointed remark, James flinched, his shoulders jerking up in surprise. Mr. Ingram was no longer wearing his usual calm expression. Instead, he was glaring at James with a bitter look. Who is the one without knowledge here? Isn't it you, who didn't even know about Michael's accomplishments? It's impossible to negotiate with someone like that. If Michael isn't handling this, then the negotiation is off. But, please wait. Just hear me out. I'm really talented and highly educated. I assure you, I can do an excellent job. Mr. Ingram shot James a disgusted glance, then stood up, preparing to leave. James, however, desperately tried to hold him back, his behavior becoming increasingly pathetic and distasteful. At this point, I could no longer just stand by and watch, so I stepped closer to the two of them. James, I think it's best if you stop now. Shut up. Do you realize whose fault this is? James shouted, brushing away my extended hand. He then glared at me, his eyes wide with anger, but I had more important things to do than to deal with him. I took a step forward and bowed deeply to Mr. Ingram. I sincerely apologize for this disturbance. I cannot offer any excuse for James's rude and disrespectful behavior, but I ask for your forgiveness. No matter how favorably one looked at it, James was entirely in the wrong in this situation. Even if the negotiation with Mr. Ingram fell through, there would be no grounds to complain, and it would simply be an unavoidable outcome. Still, I couldn't help but apologize, so I bowed deeply. Mr. Ingram responded with a calm voice. Please, raise your head, Michael. As far as I'm concerned, there is no problem as long as I can negotiate with you as planned. With a firm tone, he then turned his gaze to James. And if anyone should be apologizing, it's you, James. But, even after being told this, he seemed to think that lowering his head would mean admitting defeat. James squirmed uncomfortably, glancing back and forth between me and Mr. Ingram. Unable to tolerate his pathetic stubbornness any longer, Mr. Ingram spoke sharply. "If you still don't understand, then leave now. I have important negotiations to conduct with Michael. I'll handle the negotiations. Please, allow me to stay." Tears of fear and frustration welled up in James's eyes as he tried to approach Mr. Ingram. His eyes were red, and he occasionally sniffled pitifully. By now, his behavior was so childish it was hard to believe he was a grown adult. He was the complete opposite of the confident man who had walked into the conference room earlier, now reduced to a miserable figure. However, Mr. Ingram delivered his final ultimatum firmly. "I said leave. I don't want to see your face anymore." Upon hearing this, James staggered back a few steps, muttering incomprehensible words while shaking his head. Realizing that neither I nor Mr. Ingram would relent, he seemed to understand that he had no allies left. He hung his head low and trudged out of the office. Afterward, James returned to the company and immediately went to Mr. Smith to complain. He tried to accuse me of monopolizing the negotiation, but instead, it was James who got a scolding. "You've made quite a mess." While Michael managed to salvage the situation, why did you interfere with the work? "But, Mr. Smith, didn't you instruct me to supervise Michael closely in all future tasks?" James had expected Mr. Smith to join him in reprimanding me. Trying to win sympathy, he cozied up to Mr. Smith, but that only made things worse. "What are you talking about? It's the opposite. I told you to work alongside Michael and learn from how he does his job." But, James murmured, clearly confused. It turned out that Mr. Smith had intended to retrain James from the start. He had deliberately assigned him to my department to learn the proper attitude and work style. Mr. Smith knew James had an elitist attitude, but he had hoped that seeing me, a person without a formal education but with a proven track record, up close would change his perspective. However, James's preconceived notions were even more deeply rooted than Mr. Smith had anticipated. Believing he had nothing to learn from a middle school graduate and that his role was to discipline and weed out the unqualified, James had taken it upon himself to act recklessly. Even after all this, James continued to argue and resist. But a background check revealed that he had been taking credit for his subordinates' achievements. A review of his sales record showed he had often rewritten the accomplishments of others as his own to make himself look better. To the very end, James kept shouting, "This is Michael's revenge. He's just jealous because I'm highly educated, and he's not. It's all his fault my life is ruined." But it was obvious that he had only himself to blame. A few days later, Mr. Smith personally decided on James's punishment, assigning him to a distant overseas branch. It is a country where not only Japanese but even English was hardly spoken, so before his departure, James chose to resign voluntarily. After that, he tried several times to find a new job, but he never managed to stay anywhere for long. Still, needing to work to survive, he now reportedly works in harsh conditions at a construction site, doing manual labor. His colleagues and supervisors are all strong people who don't care about academic backgrounds, and James, lacking in physical strength, is mocked endlessly but continues to work out of necessity. As for me, the $20 million deal between Mr. Ingram and our company went smoothly after James left. Afterward, I was promoted to head of the sales department, taking on the leadership role that James had left vacant. I had once left the corporate world. At that time, I thought it would be nice to live a laid-back life. But now, I find myself surrounded by subordinates who respect me, a CEO, Mr. Smith, who relies on me, and clients who trust me with their business. Leading a fulfilling life. Even though I had been satisfied when I left the company, it seems I still have new challenges ahead. From here on, I plan to keep working hard, making the most of my abilities, alongside my colleagues at the company.